I remember coming home with my mother and walking home with her and asking, and knowing that she had lived through the 1914-18 war, I said, Mother, what is war like? And the answer that I got was, and I have thought about it many a time since, you can't get sugar.
By the time the new Parliament buildings opened at Stormont in 1932, the state of Northern Ireland was already 10 years in existence. What had seemed like a temporary partition of Ireland had taken on an air of permanence. In the northwest, the border had cut Londonderry off from its natural hinterland. Donegal farmers faced long queues at the Buncrana Road customs post before they could bring their fresh supplies of buttermilk into the city. The Catholic majority in Derry lived resentfully in a gerrymandered, unionist-controlled community.
Derry was, to me, in those days, a very drab and sad town, grey town. The Bogside area, housing-wise, was very poor. We lived in Tyrconnell Street. It was just a little house with a roof, with a trapdoor, and along the hallway, a ladder, and you put that up at bedtime and the boys and girls slept upstairs. And then we moved right across the city to a house on Duncreggan Road, which was a very nice house and bigger and better and more suitable for our needs. It was a great thing for a Catholic family to get in to the North Ward, which was usually made up of unionists. My father had a very great friend in a solicitor's office, and he bought the house in his name and handed it over to my father. And that's how it was got. It seemed a very backhanded way to do it, but it was the only way. In the Bogside, we had plenty of pubs and bookies, but not enough jobs for the people who lived there. Most of the men had to go to England or Scotland to work to earn a living. The women were the mainstay. The women always worked in the factories. They got fairly good wages. Usually they stayed from they were young girls to they were nearly grannies.
In Belfast, they were known as millies, the thousands of girls who worked in the linen and cotton mills that dominated the back streets in the west of the city. At one time, there were 20,000 mill workers, including men like John Henning from the Shankill Road.
I went to work when I was 14, and I went into a wee weaving factory place in Courtship Street, which is run off the Shankill Road. The men used to bundle up the yarn into blocks, and my job was to number them and then go and stack them away. I got paid off out of that job, and my next door neighbour was a foreman in the shipyard. So I asked him would he give me a job. So I got in working with him. All I was doing was helping the fitters, cleaning up things that they'd worked on. The shipyard was rough and ready, noisy, very, very noisy. Because you had the fitters going and you had the riveters going. It was all noise and all sheet metal moving about. It was very dangerous. 20,000 in the shipyard at one time. But in those days, there was no constant job. All you could hear was, I think there's going to be a payoff this weekend. Same as in the weaving factory. You get told, you won't be needed next week. And then you went down and signed on the bureau.
Belfast was a growing city with plenty of mouths to feed. It meant a lucrative business for farmers in the surrounding countryside. Farmers like the Scots from Strayed near Ballyclare.
It only took 3 hours for a horse and cart to reach the centre of Belfast. My father then would have gone with his buttermilk, his butter, with potatoes, eggs, cabbage and turnips. And he had his own shop customers, and they could rely on him coming with the thing, and he could rely on getting paid. It showed the interdependence upon the town and country.
Life on the farm in the 30s still meant hard manual labour with long hours, especially on market day.
We often started at 1 o'clock in the night time. We wouldn't go to bed, it wouldn't be worthwhile, so we'd strike off. For the first mile or two, the cattle might run a bit and they might try jumping into fields. We'd get into Enniskillen Fair about 8 o'clock, and you'd meet the buyers coming out. They like to buy the cattle on the road, they like to see the cattle moving. Very often we'd have our cattle sold before we'd be the length of the town. And it was lovely after walking from Gortary 15 miles to go into the coffee van and get a cup of tea at 6p. If you didn't sell the cattle, you'd have to walk them home again.
And I well remember crying with the cold on a frosty morning with my father and a potato grape, digging out the potatoes and me gathering them. But it was a very, very back-breaking job. But we usually had plenty of help. In the 30s, certainly you got as many people as you wanted at a very cheap wage to gather potatoes. There was no other work. And certainly every school was off for a fortnight about the last fortnight in October for potato gathering.
At least on most farms there was plenty to eat, even if there was little leeway for luxuries.
Pig was usually put down in the autumn time and salted down for usually about 5 weeks, and then brought out, dried and cut.
People talk about fats now that they can't touch them, but we couldn't get enough fat when we were young, and believe me, if you got a good fry up of a March morning, that bacon fat kept out the cold and you could work and you could fast.
Or even a cockerel put into the pot, exceptionally tasty, along with some good British Queen potatoes that was very, very hard to beat.
This is rather unique. Have you any idea how long it's been here?
The food might have been wholesome, but sanitary arrangements certainly weren't. That's a subject that fascinates Haldane Mitchell and Omar Doctor.
There was a house previously there, so it's from the 19th.
In his spare time, he records the disappearance of some of our most important architecture, including the humble outdoor privy.
That is where the bucket would have been placed and removed daily and emptied into a trench further down the garden.
I do remember the bucket being in it, but I was never used in my time, well, although they did grow good rhubarb down there.
I see the doors off, but when you look at a building just like we've seen, it just shows you how we have come in the last 50 years with regard to sanitation and the improvement of the health of the nation at large.
I don't know whether the ivy's holding it together or...
Let me get another photograph here.
In the era of the outside toilet, life expectancy was up to 10 years shorter than today. In town and country, people suffered terrible deprivation.
The lower down the social scale you got, the more problems you had in the poorer families. It wasn't uncommon to have D deficiencies in rickets, C deficiency in scurvy. Certainly, I would have seen more scurvy in my early years in general practice in males living on their own, just neglecting themselves with regard to bread and tea, and that was it. TB was rife in this part of the world purely because of our damp climate, and there wasn't an awful lot you could do. I mean, the people were sent to TB hospitals, and it wasn't unusual to have the little hut in the garden where the member of the family with TB lived. If they hadn't been put there and they remained within the household, the chances are that the whole family could have contracted it and died.
Short of money and good medicines, the country people often turned to charmers and faith healers for cures.
There was a cure for the running evil, there was a cure for... There was all these cures. But because they wouldn't... people didn't go to a doctor. I suppose they couldn't afford to pay the doctor.
Prior to the days of antibiotics, so many conditions literally couldn't be cured. Everything from stomach ulcers to hemorrhoids. My
father had a cure of the jaundice. Now, he pulled, I often pulled the herb when he got old. I often pulled the herb. It was the wild woodbine, and you boiled a bit of that, and you took 3 sips in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Ghost.
Everyone made time for weekly worship, and without question in the strict Presbyterian community of East Antrim, where Ernie Scott grew up.
Church was a very important part of family life, and especially at harvest time. You must remember that it was about the only place that you got any news of the week. If you were on the farm all week and then you came to church, views were expressed and news was passed. I, as a boy, and a small boy at that, would have walked 1.5 miles down to Sunday school to go in to Sunday school at 10:30. Stayed there till 5 to 12, got out and joined my parents and listened. Well over 2 hours sitting on a hard seat. Usually at 1:05, we hadn't even launched into the sermon, and the Methodist ponies and traps were coming down the street. They had finished, and that's why I wanted, as a very small boy, to be a Methodist.
That was Mass on a Sunday, and then you came and had your lunch, and my father was a great one for using the word Vespers. If he was lucky enough, he got you out to Vespers at 6 o'clock in the evening, but morning Mass was essential.
In Belfast, May King was by now a professional entertainer. She'd opened her own dance studio in Royal Avenue at the age of 17. And in summer, she took her talents to the bustling holiday resort of Portrush.
You were in charge of everything at night. You would run a concert on Sunday night, you'd run a concert on Wednesday, you'd go round the guests, and it was amazing the talent that you found. And you performed yourself, and they had an orchestra. Well, then during the day, when they were travelling, there were nearly always 6 buses, and when they went all round all the towns, I went with them and enjoyed it very much, and you had your lunch out. Well, I did 3 seasons there. I enjoyed it very much. I loved, you had all the Welsh people, the Scots people, the English people. It was marvellous. They didn't go on the continent then, you see.
Donald Sloane had left school at 14 and got a job in a Belfast printing works. But like May King, he would sooner have been an entertainer.
We went twice with my mother to a board in Ann Street for assistance for various things. Music, one of them. And for some reason, we were turned down twice.
Donald was introduced to the flute by Eddie Beale, the postman who'd rescued him and his family when they were made homeless.
He said to me, would you like to come down and join the band and learn the flute? Oh, I said, I'd love to. I'm a good amateur player. I met my wife during the time I was in the Bloomfield Amateur Band. We used to have a Saturday evening dance in the band room, and that's where I met her. She was a beautiful dancer. And we used to walk round by Crawfordsburn and up through Helen's Bay and have picnics down there at the beach.
May King was doing her bit for courting couples by taking over a dance hall off Castle Street in the centre of Belfast. The Kingsway, now derelict, was the city's ballroom of romance in the 30s.
The ordinary ballrooms were really for the working class boy and girl, and it was a way of life. And people came into ballrooms that may not even dance that night, but they would chat to people in the cloakroom. They'd go to the balcony and have a mineral and talk. A man would go over and ask a lady, would you dance? and they would dance and they would talk. They would talk because the orchestra would play beautiful melodies, and then he would ask her, he'd like to see her home. That's how it started. And many, many people have said to me, I met my husband in the Kingsway Ballroom.
I met my wife at a very strange place at the Custom House steps down at the quay. And every Sunday, half a Belfast, I think, went down the steps because there was a lot of characters there. It was a real Sunday afternoon crowd there. 2 or 3 Sundays we had met, and then I think I'd asked her out, would you like to go out to the pictures or something. And the summer night, we used to go up to the Glencairn Road and land a ditch, or maybe get into a field and land a field, talk to the other. That's the way their courting was done.
I got engaged when I was at the university with a Strabane man, actually, Gerald Lammy. He was the bank manager in the Belfast Bank in Strabane. He was a lot older than I was. I was married in the Strabane Presbyterian Church by my father, officiating, and we went on honeymoon to motoring in the Highlands of Scotland.
May King took time out from her busy career to get married too. Her husband, inevitably, was from Belfast's musical circle.
Eddie was the organist in St Bridget's Chapel, and we were married there. Although it was out of my parish, we lived in the Glen Road. And we went to Dublin and went to all the shows, and then we went down to Killarney. We toured around Killarney. It was a very happy time.
Well, I was married in Mount Pottinger Presbyterian Church. Agnes had some friends, I think it was Ballyclare. They gave us a lovely reception. But other than that was all we had. We couldn't afford a honeymoon. We're lucky to be able to pay the rent.
We went to a wee place called P.O.W. and a woman had landed her wee country house. We were married on a Saturday, and we went down there from Saturday to Sunday afternoon, and we come home and we got lodged into a house, and it was one room, and in that room you made your dinner and you slept in it, your meals in it. Thank God we're only in for about 2 or 3 weeks. And then this woman came to us and said that a wee house going in Derry Street and the rent man wants £8 for the key.
Whether you lived with your in-laws or in single-room lodgings, marriage was a must. The moral climate of the time wouldn't have tolerated the idea of the one-parent family, nor living in sin.
A single girl who would have got pregnant in those days would have been shipped off to somewhere, Australia even, literally to Australia, never to be seen again. You see, it was an utter disgrace in those days.
She probably cleared off somewhere, or she either had her child and never came out of the house again. She usually stayed in, never attended any functions. It was an awful disgrace.
I remember one good-looking maid. We wondered why she was getting so fat, and she was only about 20, and she got fatter and fatter, and then she went away. And I said to my grandparents, "What happened to Nellie?" An icy silence followed, and I could see that the subject was not to be mentioned. Well, about a year later, Happy Nellie appeared again. It was all smoothed over, and an orphanage or somebody dealt with the child.
You didn't talk about the birds and the bees. As far as you were concerned, I mean, this sounds ridiculous for me to talk at my time of life, but you still kind of believed in the cabbage at the end of the garden.
I was married at 22 years of age, and we went into the bed, but it had nothing to do with my wife the next day. Strange it may seem. And then when the time comes for their periods to come round, I wondered what was wrong. And that was the first time that I knew him in a period.
Marriage was even more difficult for country folk. There was the problem of isolation and of who took over the farm.
The country people married later in life, in most cases. If a man had a sister, he couldn't bring in a wife till his sister got married, and then, as the saying was, to be an empty stake, and someone had set round about getting a wife for him. In lots of cases, there was a match made for him.
Marriage was confined to how far a man could walk to see a young lady. But once the bicycle came, you could go to a dance in another town land, or even in another town.
I filled in a coupon that I got in some weekly paper every 2 months, postal order for 4 shillings till the bike was paid for. And the full price of that bicycle was £3, 17 and 6pence. We would maybe cycle down to Black Lion, have a couple of drinks and cycle away to a dance.
The world was shrinking in other ways too. With the invention of the wireless, people could sit in their own homes and listen to news and entertainment from around the world.
It was a little black box like that, you see, and there was a little wire and a little, you thought it was a little piece of coal, and you always got him on there. And then you put on the earphones, and you sat and you waited. And you were rather nervous, you see, and Mommy was looking, I was the first to test it on me. La da da da, la da da da. That was the first. It was so Romeo. I was amazed. It made you jump, you know, the big tenor voice coming out. And then I nodded my head to them, and then the earphones were taken over to Mama here a bit, and then they were taken over to Daddy here, and then with another friend. Great excitement.
It was the first in our Marlbank area, and everyone, all round about, people came at every night to hear the London clock striking in Sheridan's. That was the highlight. This was unbelievable. Big Ben striking 12.
It was largely through listening to the radio that people were able to follow events in Germany.
Made a formal entry into the demilitarized zone.
The disturbing rise of Hitler and the Nazis, and the plunge into World War II.
Hitler addressed the Reichstag at noon.
About 1936, he began to loom on the horizon, and the Nazis very strongly, and we didn't quite know how serious they were. And then they went into Czechoslovakia, and that was terribly dangerous. We began to really wonder what's going to happen. And then when he took Danzig, we knew it's pretty likely there may be war. And then they went into Poland, and that was the end of it.
We're sitting in the house on a Sunday, and the word come across that Chamberlain was going to speak to the nation.
And the clergyman came up onto the pulpit and announced that war was declared. None of us had heard it, but he had heard it on the radio.
I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.
And I remember Mummy sitting and looking like that. And then when you walked down Norfolk Drive and you got on the bus, there was great fuss. The war's coming, the war's coming.
People reached to the recruiting office and they join up, and I was one of them.
From university at Cambridge, John Leslie took an officer's commission in the Irish Guards. He was among the first into Europe with the British Expeditionary Force.
They were well into France, and we had to stop them getting to Dunkirk at Boulogne. And we were just rifles and Bren guns against tanks. And luckily they thought we were much stronger than we were. And so it held them up for 24 hours.
John Henning had joined the Territorial Army in the 30s, At the outbreak of war, he was drafted into the regular army and sent off to England.
It was like a phony war, nothing was happening. And then all of a sudden, Dunkirk. We were caught in the beaches, and I had to call in all boats of all sizes to come to the shores of Dunkirk and pick up the retreating soldiers. And I was one of them where I learned to run from the Germans with a bit of a help. You had to go through the water waist deep to get on a boat, and it didn't matter, it wasn't a liner or anything, you know, and to get on a wee fishing boat or anything, then they could get across the water and get home, back out home into England. Then we had to go through a medical test. They found out that I had very poor eyesight, I had very good vision, and I had mental strain. That's what they said was unfit for further military service. But then I came home and I became an air raid warden.
I was captured at Boulogne with a battalion of the Irish Guards. We were marched off into Germany or packed into trucks or cattle wagons on trains, and 2 weeks later we were at a prison camp in Germany.
Maeve Kelly, not long out of school in Derry, joined the Wrens.
I worked in a store round the back of the Guildhall that the ship's company used to come in and get food and clothing and everything, and then they'd take it out into the boats and away.
Other women found themselves down on the farm, not to milk cows, but to help the war effort by working in temporary munitions factories. There was work for everyone. With many able-bodied men away to fight, Ernie Scott, an only son, was called home from grammar school to help dig for victory.
In those days, 3/4 of your arable land had to be laboured. Let you grow potatoes, turnips or whatever you liked on it, had to be ploughed. I did not want to come home to farm, far from it. But in those days you did what your parents told you.
Ernie Scott joined the Home Guard as soon as he was old enough, as did thousands of others, including Donald Sloan, whose father had been killed in the First World War.
I didn't go because I said I'm not going to leave Agnes the way my mother was left. I joined a transport unit of the Home Guard.
Mr. Eden called for local defence volunteers to supplement the regular forces, and in every city, town and village, the response was immediate.
Our Home Guard, they had there was no arms, no anything. You just ran to the next fella that was on there, and you said this, you repeated this message, and he was to run to the next fella, and so on. And this was the way we were supposed to give word if Hitler was coming. So I thought to myself, I'll join the Home Guard, and when I hear Hitler's coming, I'll not run to the next fella, I will run all the way to the Free State. I'm afraid of my life. I was always a coward.
We discovered the Royal Engineers, they were going to mine the Ballinure Bridge, that if Hitler's panzers happened to come to Ballinure, the bridge would be blown up and they would have to stay at one side of the water and wouldn't get over. But none of us ever thought in those days that all a panzer had to do was push its nose up against a house, knock the house down and clamber right over the top and come on. If they had blown the bridge up, I don't think it would have stopped Hitler's panzers from coming next Ballybowly.
Hitler's panzers never reached Ballybowly, but Belfast was well within reach of the Luftwaffe. 1,200 people died in the devastating air raids of May 1941.
The older people didn't go out. They stayed and sat under the stairs, thought it was safe. But the younger people in middle age would go right up into the hills. And it's strange to say, it was always a lovely night because the Germans really wanted a night when the moon was shining so that it would shine on the water at the docks. And there'd be the first plane, huge, with a very red light at the top and a small one at the back. And then there were the smaller planes, beautiful formation, and they would all be coming over and you'd all be looking up at them and you could hear the was frightening. So that was the sign that people would pray. Now it went from field to field. It seemed to spread for miles. Our Father who art in heaven, all the prayers come up, you know. And then the silence would come because they got right into Belfast. And then you would see the flames coming up, different parts coming up. It was horrifying. There was one terrible landmine came down opposite the library and it made a terrible crater. But no one was hurt that night, but everyone went next day to see the crater.
We were called out in one of the streets there off facing the Midland Railway whenever they bombed the shipyard and part of the railway there.
A landscape tires up off the Crumlin Road. It was Blitz. You had to go up there and bring people out of their houses that fallen in around them. My own house got it in Derry Street. A couple of places round about us were flattened. But what happened to my house in number 15 was that it blew apart, but it didn't crumble. And what they did to save rebuilding them, they got 3 big iron crosses and that like that, and they put them on the outside and screwed them tight, just a clump, so that my house was clumped together with them feet, and they became known as the 3 draws. You know, they're doing the pools in them days.
The rationing that we experienced here in Derry was absolutely for nothing, because you'd only had to go across the border and walk down 5 miles or less down the road, muff or out the other way, so that we were not rationed really. They couldn't compare our rationing to what they went through in England and Scotland and Wales.
People missed milk a lot. A lot of people missed. That was only for nursery mothers and that, you see, and babies. And the bread, it was brown stuff. If you got white flour, it was great. But you always managed. We were always pretty lucky. And coming up and down to Dublin, where we even brought things for different people, you know. But it was hard. But everybody kept their nice slim figures then.
Clothes were very hard to get, to see, in Derry, because you didn't have the coupons. So this smart aleck of a fella goes down to Buncrana and he wears a very old suit, you see. And he goes in and buys the suit. I know the fella. And he bought the suit and he said, would you parcel it up for me, to the man in the shop, who very kindly did so. And he handed it to him. So he carried it down. The old train was coming then from Buncrana to Derry, and he thought, on the way up, I'm going to chuck out these old clothes, you see, and nobody know where I'm smuggling. And he'd thrown out the suit, the trousers and the jacket out onto the railway track, and he opened up the parcel and there was only a jacket in it. He had no trousers. The fellow in the shop had forgotten to give them to me. Well, I laughed my heart out. He was not one bit pleased.
That's when a lot of money was made, because anything you grew, it doesn't matter what you grew, you could sell. And in fact, many farmers made a fortune out of flax, which was in great demand. They were covering Hurricane airplanes with flax, with the linen. And this flax had to be going somewhere, because the main producer before the war had been Belgium, and of course it was overrun.
The war was dreadful for some people. It was dreadful for them to live through, but for others it was tops, because there was plenty of money. Everybody wanted to get out of the blackout. Everybody was going to a theatre, they were going to a play, they were going to a studio to dance, they were going to a ballroom. They got out of their homes, they had their little flash lamp, and they were going somewhere, and were going in, and the places were packed.
Oh, turned out nice again, hasn't it? Give me a hand, George, quick. Oh, it's cold. That's not my hand, it's my ukulele.
I don't mean to be disloyal to anybody who's around, but I just had myself a grand time. I mean, there's no point in saying that you were working for king and country. One of the greatest things that bothered me, it really did bother me, was that you didn't get mixed up in the fella you were out with in the afternoon and the fella you were out with in the evening, if he was Joe and he was John, that was my big worry, was to call him the right name.
Life brightened up even more with the arrival of the Americans.
I was in a shop on the waterside on the first floor, and I remember looking down and saw all these wee caps, all these wee things all bobbing about and all moving, and I thought, what's that? Because it was a peculiar coloured uniform. Suddenly I realised it was a regiment of American Army, and the reason why it was so peculiar was they were wearing rubber boots. And you didn't hear them. We were used to the British Army in their hobnail boots. Derry was the most important base on the western approaches. A gentleman told me that he counted 136 warships tied up outside, up near the Guildhall. 136. Anybody who was of any importance was in Derry. I saw General Eisenhower, and he came into Derry, and they had a camp out the Letterkenny Road. At the same time, you had Bob Hope out there.
From the States, the States, that's where Churchill lives.
So from the sublime to the ridiculous.
Well, he doesn't exactly live there. He just goes back once in a while to deliver Mrs. Roosevelt's laundry.
I heard the Glenn Miller sound out there too.
The trouble with the Americans was that they had so much money, and our poor men, our soldiers, had very little, and so they were apt to commandeer the girls.
They made such an impact. You see, they were so beautifully dressed. I mean, an ordinary Marine and an ordinary soldier and an ordinary sailor, they had beautiful material and lovely cut suits and more slacks and trousers, whereas your poor old Matlow in the British Navy, sure, he had anything on him. And then you see the Americans had so much for men in those days, aftershaves and things that the men over here didn't use. So the very smell of them, you see, attracted them to the girls.
Hundreds of local girls succumbed to the smell of that aftershave and married GIs. Many more wept at the quayside when the Americans left.
Generally speaking, they had successful marriages and are now, by the way, coming back to Ireland now as pensioners or older people just to visit.
They didn't treat you well. We lived on the Red Cross parcels.
As soon as the name of a prisoner has been received, the Red Cross starts to look after him. It sends him parcels at regular intervals, and in this
each Red Cross parcel had a bar of chocolate in it, and chocolate was absolutely unknown in Germany.
The first days of their captivity.
And so we could bribe some of the sentries to bring in parts of a wireless, and it was hidden somewhere. And so every evening, the BBC News was written out on little slips of paper, which were read, and then we'd burn them in the stoves. So extraordinary as it may seem, we got the BBC News practically every evening.
This is Colonel Britton speaking to the V Army. Write up your V's again. You know, and I know, what it stands for.
We were at this gigantic camp, Moosberg. Well, it was full of everything you can imagine. Russians, Mongolians with slit eyes, Indians in turbans, Belgians, French, Poles, American Air Force, hundreds of American Air Force just sleeping on straw in tents. And it was absolute chaos. And it was just a sea of mud, really. And finally, we knew the Patton's army was getting very near. We heard explosions, and then we saw these tanks creeping over the hills, and we were all under crossfire. We were all told to lie on our stomachs, And then these great Sherman tanks came up to the door between two towers with searchlights and machine guns, and they just scrunched down this enormous door, and we knew we were free.
I remember the U-boats, when 15 of them surrendered in Derry. They came in from the open sea at Moville. These sailors coming up the Foyle stood on the leading deck of the leading submarine. This British naval officer came out. Now, he was the welcoming party. Off stepped the German with all his sailors looking at him, you know, and they weren't even washed, they weren't even fed, and held out his hand. The Englishman ignored him. Now, I thought to myself, how very rude. I mean, there are winners and losers, but as one officer to the other, he should have at least shook his hand.
We went to an airport nearby after about a week, and we were flown back in Lancaster bombers. Instead of putting bombs in the bomb holes, they put us. Landed at a delousing camp in England, and you were given immediately 2 months' leave. You were sent straight home, given your railway ticket. And so I got to Belfast on a boat, and I took the train down here. And word had got ahead in some strange way, and the village people kindly met me at the station and had a huge bonfire out in front of the house there.
We may allow ourselves a brief period of rejoicing. Today is Victory in Europe's Day.
Okay, we made a beeline over and we got into the Royal Avenue Hotel and we got up to the big lounge above. There were the big windows and we could see everything. Do you know, it was marvellous. The crowds, they'd on fancy hats, they had balloons, there were women dressed in the flags and they were singing and they were hugging each other. And you know, it really was lovely to see those people able to do that.
There was great rejoicings in Strabane, and I remember a wonderful bonfire on the top of Knockavoe Mountain, and we all hauled as much wood as we could up. We were all younger in those days, and to the top, and it was because of course we had to vie with the other bonfires round about in the countryside.
Oh, there was great jollification everywhere. They'd put up arches and crowds that went down to the city hall. I would think that ceasefire we had here 2 or 3 years ago was just the same thing. Catholic and Protestant were all one then. It was great, great. The war was over and we're looking forward to a new life.
The war had hastened change in many areas of life, nowhere more so than on the farm, where demand for greater productivity had seen the horse give way to the tractor.
They and themselves made the biggest contribution to the change in agriculture for the simple reason that a day's work could be done with a tractor and plough that it would nearly take a pair of horses 5 days to do. This was the start of the mechanisation of the farms. And of course, farmers being handy with their hands, they cut the horse shafts down and made them into tractor shafts just rather than buy tractor implements. They converted the horse implement into the implement for the tractor and used the tractor just in the place of the 2 horses.
My grandparents had died, and so I took over the place here and just kept things going, really, as they were, as much as possible. In 1953, being an old bachelor, and my sister and my brother Desmond being married with a lot of children, they really wanted to live here with their ponies for the children and all. And so I said, look, you take over the place, and I'll go and live in Rome, which I loved. I had a lot of friends there. And so I moved to Rome and restored an old house and lived there exactly 40 years. But I came back usually a month a year in September, and so it wasn't too bad.
My husband died In 1948, he became ill and we didn't know really what was wrong with him, but I know now that it was leukemia. He had a very long illness. It's always a struggle then and now to bring up young children on your own, especially if you haven't much cash and you have to go out and work to support them. But I was fortunate in going to live with my parents, and my father became both grandfather and took the place of their father.
Despite his varicose veins and poor eyesight, John Henning was to make a name for himself as a world-class marathon runner.
My first marathon was in 1945, and I had only about less than 6 months training for it.
John was 6 times the All-Ireland champion, and with victories in several English marathons too, he was in contention for a place in the 1948 British Olympic team. But at the Olympic trial in London, it all went cruelly wrong.
I started off in the race, but I lost myself on going 2 wrong ways. I followed him on a bike, thought he was with the race, and he wasn't. And I had been redirected back by the crowd shooting at me. And when I got to the stadium, I went to the wrong opening. But when I got inside the stadium, I finished 4th. And the team manager there said, "Oh, Henning, you'll be on the team all right." But I was sitting at my tea one night with my wife, and it came over the radio that the first competitors for the Olympic Games had been mentioned, and it mentioned the marathon, and I wasn't on it. And I just left my dinner, went up the stairs and cried my eyes out.
John would go on to compete in the Commonwealth Games, followed by a long career as an athletics administrator, but nothing would fully compensate for that one wayward Olympic trial.
And the strange thing about it all is that the fella that was 3rd never beat me in any race, either before that or after it.
And the greatest of all Olympic events, the marathon.
Even to this day, it sticks in my heart that I missed that by 20 yards.
The Flora has nothing to worry about now and goes on to win the race for Argentine.
After the war, Maeve Kelly stayed on in the Wrens for a few years and then decided to look for a job in Civvy Street. But she knew the prospects in her home city were bleak.
I knew there was no point in me trying for a job in my hometown. I was a Catholic, and therefore any job that I would go for was already filled. It was incredible to think that a city of about 98% nationalists were ruled by 12 councillors, that they could move the city about vote-wise, gather them all into, for instance, the Bogside area, and keeping the Catholics under control. So I saw an advertisement in the Belfast Telegraph for this Northern Ireland Housing Trust, and I applied and got the job in Belfast. In those days, for anybody in Derry or this part of the world to go to Belfast was like going to outer space. Absolutely. You nearly took a picnic with you on the train. I was quite willing to go away and get a job and let them get on with it down here.
In part 3 of The Lives of Our Time, Maeve Kelly sees the worst of sights in Belfast and the greatest in the ring. Jean Lamy trades tea leaves for a new kind of cleaner. John Henning is down in the dumps again, and revolution is in the air.